I am Sue Drover. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I am the director for the Stewart Community Library and Museum, and it has been greatly my honor to be able to host the exhibit downstairs, The Americans and the Holocaust. It's been a story long in coming, and I'm very grateful over the fact that we were chosen as one of 50 libraries in the nation to host that exhibit over the next 2 years. I am lucky enough, and I think we all can share in that luck, to have Rebecca Erbelding. She's a historian from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., and I was allowed to go there for a couple of days of training and got some training from her personally, and I'm very excited that they felt that it was important enough that they sent a representative to come and share some of their experience with us, and I'd like to thank her for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm thrilled to be here. Let me know if you need more amplification, and I can lean into the mic a little bit more as we go. As Sue said, I am a historian at the Holocaust Museum in D.C. I worked on the exhibit downstairs. I was the lead historian on that project. So when we get to the Q&A section, if you've been through that exhibit and have any questions about anything you've seen, feel free to ask. I'm not sure how many of you were able to attend the opening event with Tom Kizio last week, but if you did, he has written extensively on the Alaska Plan, and his stuff is great. And so if you have any other questions about anything that I show you today or want to learn more, look him up. And I'm also happy to take any questions about it as well. So my expertise is on U.S. government responses to the Holocaust, and I'm going to talk about how the Alaska Plans fit into this wider history of immigration in the 1930s and 1940s, and about how it fit into efforts to aid Jews more broadly and the backlash to those efforts. I think there's often a tendency when we talk about American responses to the Holocaust to think that Americans either knew everything about what was going on in Europe or they knew nothing, and either way they didn't do anything. And I think it's really important to emphasize that Americans never speak with one voice on anything. We fight all the time about everything. And that was true in the 1930s and 1940s as well. There were really passionate debates over what the U.S. role in the world was, what we should do when confronted with this refugee crisis, and how we can help or not help. And so I always try to use American responses with a plural. And I'm going to talk about multiple Alaska plans. Despite the name of my presentation, there should be an S there. There were Alaskan plans. So first, let's set the stage of what the U.S. looked like in the 1930s. A refugee crisis never comes out of the blue, and it didn't then either, and neither does America's reaction to it. So it's always pretty complicated, and it's important to look back, not so that we're looking with hindsight to judge, but so that we can understand what is happening in these moments. So we'll start in 1918 at the end of World War I. So the U.S. is only involved in the war for a very short amount of time, and the entire experience from the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, the U.S. decision not to join the League of Nations, all of it convinces Americans that we do better when we are on our side of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The U.S. becomes deeply isolationist on a bipartisan basis throughout the 1920s. We pare down our military, saying we are never going to go to war again. We have the oceans to protect us. World War I is considered a mistake that the U.S. should have avoided. The country is, of course, segregated. It is segregated legally in many places and by custom in others. And Americans are very concerned about issues of race and genetics. This is the rise of the eugenics movement, this feeling that some people are biologically better than others. And the Ku Klux Klan reemerges in this moment. And this is from a Klan rally in Washington, D.C. in 1927. And one of the things that you notice about this photo is that it's basically a parade. And people are not wearing their hoods. And the reason that they're not wearing their hoods is it's not disqualifying to be a member of the Klan. There had been, a post-Civil War Klan that was specifically anti-Black. This Klan is anti-anyone they consider to be less than 100% American. So they're anti-Catholic, they're anti-immigrant, and they're anti-Black. And in the 1920s, when there's about 130 million Americans, more than 1% are card-carrying members of the Klan, and probably many more are quite sympathetic to the Klan's kind of overall thing. So these factors, this isolationism after World War I, this ideas about race and genetics, this widespread acceptance of racism and anti-Semitism, it leads to the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. And this act ends all idea that we have in our heads about immigrants arriving at Ellis Island and going through this kind of arrival process. From here on, there are numerical limits on the number of people who can come into the country in any given year. It is capped at a little more than 150,000 people per year. And due to the racial theories that I mentioned, that 153,000 is like a pie. And each country gets a little piece of the pie, a piece of the quota. If you are born in the Western Hemisphere, you can immigrate to the US with no numerical limits. But if you're born anywhere else in the world, there's a numerical limit on how many people can immigrate any year. It is kind of basically designed to create the America of the future, the America that these congressmen in the 1920s want, which is an America that is white and Protestant. And so they give the largest pieces of the pie to white Protestant nations that they think will reliably send white Protestant immigrants. So of the 153,000 or so people every year, 65,000 of those visa slots are reserved for people who were born in Great Britain or Northern Ireland. Almost half. For Germany, it's about 26,000 people per year. So Germany actually has a fairly high, large piece of that pie. So in terms of Alaska, this act, this Immigration Act, officially defines what the United States is. It's the states, it is the territories of Alaska and Hawaii, and it is the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. So you note that it doesn't include other U.S. territories like the Philippines, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But for our story, this is very important because it means that any future refugee projects need to figure out a way to carve Alaska out of the United States for that project to work. So we can look at this slide again, this Immigration Act slide again, and there is one really important thing that is missing, and that is the question of refugees. So the U.S. in the 1920s and 30s, and through the end of World War II, has no refugee law. So you cannot come as a refugee, as a migrant, as an asylum seeker. We have two categories of immigration. It is immigrant or tourist. So you can come to the U.S. temporarily as a tourist, or you can come permanently as an immigrant, and those are your choices. So even though the term refugee is used all the time in the 1930s to talk about Jews who are trying to escape Nazi Germany, it has no legal definition. And so you are only coming under this very slow, long, deliberate immigration process. And this works pretty well at first, this Immigration Act. It does what the intenders want it to do. And then in 1929, the Great Depression begins, and immigration plummets as a result. So you can see here this chart. Quota immigration in the late 1920s is generally filled. There's, at that point, 164,000 slots per year. It's generally filled. It gets reduced in 1930 to the number that I was talking about, and you can see that it plummets after this. President Herbert Hoover had instructed the State Department to very specifically interpret an old law called the likely to become a public charge. So you could not, in the early 1930s, under Hoover's instruction, if you could not support yourself indefinitely upon coming to the United States without even getting a job, because you can't take a job through an American, if you can't support yourself indefinitely, you are not eligible to enter the United States.
Right.
So 1933, the same year that Franklin Roosevelt becomes president and Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany, the U.S. has the smallest amount of immigration in recorded U.S. history. 8,220 people immigrate to the U.S. that year. More people actually leave the U.S. than enter that year. So when Roosevelt takes the oath of office and he says that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, famously in his inaugural, Americans are kind of looking around and seeing quite a lot that they have to fear. This is 4 years into the Depression. 25% of the American workforce is unemployed at this point. And Americans are also looking across the ocean and seeing Nazi Germany and its new leader, Adolf Hitler. Reports about Nazi Germany are in the front pages of newspapers across the country. This is the Seward Daily Gazette from March 25th, 1933. You can see they love a headline. And a short story, many headlines, many short stories. They act downstairs in the exhibit in the hallway. You can see up close some of the Stewart Daily Gazettes, some of the real ones, which is very cool. But 6 of these headlines are about Nazi Germany. 6 of them. We are in March 1933. We are less than 2 months after Hitler has taken power. And 6 of them are about what is happening in Nazi Germany. So here's an easier one. Here's the Daily Alaska Empire in Juneau. This is March 31st, 1933. And you can see that the second headline is Boycott on Jews starts Saturday. So they're talking about the nationwide Nazi-sponsored boycott of Jewish-owned businesses in Germany. And they know about it in advance. It will start on Saturday. It will start the day after this newspaper is published. And so you can be in Juneau and know that this is about to happen. So, and we know Americans are reading all of these articles about the boycott of Jewish-owned businesses, about the burning of books, about Jews being kicked out of the civil service. All of that happens in the spring of 1933. And there are hundreds of petitions that get sent to the State Department and to the White House asking for the U.S. government to do something about it. Nobody's quite sure what, but do something, make it stop. Help the poor people. I couldn't find any petitions from Alaska, but I realized I only searched the State Department records. And because Alaska was a territory, it would have been in the territorial records. And I just didn't get there when I was at the National Archives. But this is a petition from the citizens of Dallas, Texas. It's the result of an interfaith meeting. And they say that Germany has adopted a policy of racial discrimination. And that we, the citizens of Dallas, in public assembly, we deplore this new attack on the rights of peaceful people to life and liberty. And they ask the U.S. government to do something about it. This is thousands of people. A news article said it was more than 10,000 people gathered in City Hall in Dallas, Texas, protesting what the Nazis are doing. But after this initial kind of burst of energy in the spring of 1933, one thing we know from U.S. history is that it is very difficult to sustain a protest movement. And Americans, especially in this period of unemployment, really start refocusing on domestic concerns, on recovery from the Great Depression, on the New Deal, on the end of Prohibition and the beginning of beer sales, on all of the other things that are going on in the spring of 1933. And Hitler had been watching all of the protests too, and decided that he was going to scale back Philadelphia. He wasn't going to do these big events, these boycotts, these book burnings, these things that are photographable and able to be disseminated as headlines in newspapers. And so you don't see these major events in Nazi Germany again until 1935, because Hitler is waiting and the U.S. gets distracted. But for thousands of people who are seeking refuge, America still represents possibility, this land of freedom and opportunity and away from the persecution that they knew at home. And throughout the early 1930s, more than 90,000 people joined the waiting list to enter the United States. The State Department slowly, under Roosevelt's instruction, began to lessen its public charge restriction and to let more people in. But the quota is not maxed out. They are not allowing the maximum number of people that could come to come. These are some of the documents that you would need to get out of Germany and into the United States as an immigrant, or just to get a U.S. visa in general. It doesn't matter what country you're coming from. You don't have to read all of this. It's just meant to show that it's very complicated. And I think sometimes people, especially students, will ask, well, why didn't Jews just leave? And the answer is it's very difficult to leave, and it's very difficult to find a place to come to. So potential immigrants needed to collect their birth certificates, marriage certificates, military discharge papers if they're male. They need a certificate of good conduct from the German police that says that they're not wanted for any sort of crime. And most of them, because this public charge clause is still there, most of them need a financial sponsor. They need an American who will vouch for them. And that American needs to submit their own tax documents and insurance statements and letters of recommendation from people in their communities saying this is a good person who won't abandon this refugee if they're allowed to come. You need to pass a physical from a State Department approved physician. After the war begins, you need a ship ticket in advance to show that you can physically leave. The ramifications of getting it wrong are very real. A lot of this stuff has to be collected in a certain order. You need to pay for it. You can't get it on the internet, so you have to physically go to different offices and get these papers. Dorothy Thompson, the journalist, wrote in 1938, it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. It is clear by 1938 that life in Germany is becoming unbearable for Jews. In March, Germany annexed Austria, which brought another 192,000 Jewish people under Nazi control, and everything that had happened kind of slowly in Germany happened suddenly in Austria. Thousands of people are waiting outside the American consulate in Vienna now. You could see kind of this fuzzy picture on the side. That's the American consulate. Roosevelt does a couple of things. He combines the German and the Austrian quotas. He also calls an international conference in Evian, France, and 32 nations come to this conference. And you can see the headline from the Washington Post, "Yes, but attitude perils progress at World Refugee Convention." So most of the nations attending declare in this kind of polite diplomatic language that they are not interested in more refugees. Some of them say it's for economic reasons. Most of them say something along the lines of what Australia says, which is, we don't have a racial problem and we don't care to begin a racial problem. Which is false on many levels, but here we are. American Jewish organizations have been kind of keeping track for a long time where Jews lived in the world. They had been permitted, many of them, to attend the Evian conference, but they were not permitted to speak at the Evian conference. This is 1938. This is their geographic distribution of Jews in America in 1938. And you can see there's about 4.8 million Jewish people in the continental U.S. And in Alaska, it's very small. Alaska has a population at that point of a little more than 59,600 Jewish people in Alaska, about 1% of Alaskans. So Alaska does not come up as a possibility at Evian. It is not discussed during the Evian conference because the U.S. at that conference pledges, we will allow the maximum number of people in under the Johnson-Reed Act from 1924. And since Alaska is considered as part of the United States under that law, there's no need to discuss Alaska as a separate haven because the quota applied in Alaska. So anti-Semites, though, are an exception because they are paying attention to Alaska in the late 1930s. This is an anti-Semitic newspaper that was published. It was called The Weekly Liberator. It was published by William Dudley Pelley, who ran an anti-Semitic organization called the Silver Shirts. And in February 1938, he publishes an article called Concerning Alaskan Spies. And this article claims that there is a Jewish government in Washington. They are setting up a Jewish government in Alaska. That Jewish government will send weapons to communist Russia in a way to, and that is why Japanese boats have been seen off the shores of Alaska. It's very convoluted, but he's actually kind of getting at something earlier that people are going to say later in much later soaps. November 1938, the Kristallnacht attacks. In response to the assassination of a minor German diplomat in Paris, the Nazis launch a series of attacks against Jewish-owned property, Jewish bodies, Jewish-owned businesses throughout Germany. Synagogues are burned. 30,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to concentration camps. This is the first mass roundup of Jews just for being Jewish. And it is the largest sustained newspaper coverage of any event related to the persecution of Jews. It's front page news in the U.S. for weeks. And you can see the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, a day after the Kristallnacht attacks end, has inexorable treatment of Jewish race. German government threatened good people with more grief. So Roosevelt does a couple of things after Kristallnacht. He condemns the attacks. He summons the U.S. ambassador in Berlin back for consultation. The U.S. is the only government to remove its head diplomat as a sign of protest. And he also allows people who are here on tourist visas who don't feel safe going home to stay indefinitely. There's about 12,000 people who were able to stay in the U.S. for the entirety of World War II as tourists because they don't feel safe going home. Americans are conflicted about this new refugee crisis. So it's clear that Europe is getting worse for Jews, but unlike in 1933, when the protests seemed to be make it stop over there, it is very clear it is not stopping over there, and that the solution to the problem might be getting those people out. And so Americans are less interested in that. So you can see, this is a Gallup poll from November 1938. Do you approve or disapprove of the Nazi treatment of Jews in Germany? 94% of Americans disapprove. And then the same people are asked, well, should we allow a larger number of Jewish exiles to come to live here? And 72% saying no. So throughout this entire period, it's thoughts and prayers. There's this persistent disconnect between sympathy and willingness to be part of the solution, which at this point is immigration. And this is when Alaska comes back into the picture. So less than a week after Kristallnacht, Congressman Charles Barkley, who is a Democrat from the Bronx, publicly proposes creating a haven for what he called political refugees in Alaska. This was the polite term that they used to refer to Jewish refugees. When you didn't want to say Jewish because you thought that might be a deal breaker for people, you say political. That happened at Evian all the time too. I'm not sure if you can read this, but he says that Alaska is, this is a quote, Alaska is a land well endowed by nature, is, quote, practically uninhabited, and he argued that Alaskan companies are always trying to get more workers, and so in his mind, this is perfect, right? He planned to introduce legislation to remove Alaska from the Johnson-Reed Act so that immigration would not be limited in the same way that it was in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, DC, and the other 48, or the lower 48. Francis Perkins, who was the one who was pushing FDR to allow tourists to stay, also supports opening a separate quota for immigration to Alaska. But when Buckley here asks FDR for his support, will you come out and say that you also favor this? The president says, well, Alaska is a fantastic place for potential future development, but we cannot treat it like a foreign territory. And so this is off the table. He said it was, quote, obviously out of the question. But the need is there, and the need keeps growing. So January 1st, 1939, less than 2 months after Kristallnacht, you can see that the German and Austrian quota is 27,370. That's the number of people who can legally come every year. The number of applicants is 240,748. Numerically a 9-year waiting list if you want to come to the U.S. Remember, the war hasn't even started yet. We're still 9 months away from the war beginning, but people are kind of looking around Europe, and even in countries that have not been touched by the Nazis yet are getting nervous. Romania has a much smaller quota, 377 people per year can immigrate to the U.S. They have numerically a 43-year wait. Americans at this point are polled again on another question, a similar question. If you were a member of Congress, would you vote to allow to open the doors of the U.S. to a larger number of European refugees than now admitted under the quota? And you can see only 9% say yes. The idea that Americans are this united on anything is kind of shocking. 83% of Americans say no. We do not think we should open our doors to more European refugees. And the issue for Roosevelt here is that the largest voices and the loudest voices in opposition are Democrats. His own party. So many more bills are introduced in 1939 and 1940 to end immigration or cut immigration than there is to open immigration any further. Robert Reynolds, a Democrat from North Carolina, wrote to his fellow citizens, quote, in March 1939, and he was the loudest voice in opposition. He is writing this in response to a potential bill to allow refugee children into the U.S. outside of the immigration quotas. And he wrote, all the nations of impoverished Europe wish to dump their political, economic, and undesired minorities upon us. Write to your senators and to your congressmen to aid me to put legislation on the statute books, which will shut off immigration entirely during this period of unemployment and hardship and distress for young and old among our people. And furthermore, to expel from this country the alien propagandist, the habitual criminal, and the alien diseased or insane. At this point, newspapers are reporting that the world is on the verge of war. And in September 1939, when Nazi Germany invades Poland, 90% of Americans want to stay neutral. And so one of Reynolds' refrains is that we need to have America that protect America's children and Europe can protect Europe's children, and we should not get involved. Francis Perkins and other members of the Roosevelt administration who were sympathetic to the plight of German Jews had not given up. It was clear that the American people and most of Congress were not in favor of enlarging the quotas, but Alaska felt like it was a potential loophole. In January 1939, that same month as that poll, there was a meeting at the Labor Department about bringing refugees to Alaska. And the participants were trying to figure out how they could square this, how they could get these restrictionist members of Congress, the American people on board with this. And they decided that the thing that they needed to do is treat Alaska like a colony, like a territory, not like part of the U.S. So they thought they could argue that this was about boosting the Alaskan economy. We're not going to argue that it's about refugees, but it's about boosting the economy because a larger population in Alaska would serve in the national defense. They also thought that 6 or 7 private companies, non-profit corporations, they said, as if there's such a thing, non-profit corporations would be granted concessions to develop kind of concerns in Alaska, mining and logging and that sort of thing. They would have to use immigrant labor. And those immigrants, and this is crucial, and this is how they were going to sell it, they would not be permitted to leave Alaska and resettle anywhere in the lower 48 until Alaska became a state. So through the next 8 months, they try to figure out how to put this together. And government officials keep getting letters from Americans asking about Alaska. So these are 2 letters that FDR receives saying, why don't we consider Alaska? Let's think about Alaska. None of these letters are from Alaskans. That's important. In August 1939, the Department of the Interior finally releases their report. They call it the Problem of Alaskan Development. It is nicknamed the Slattery Report because it's named for Undersecretary Henry Slattery. And the report proposes moving 10,000 settlers into Alaska each year for the next 5 years, so a total of 50,000. They argued that the increase in population would surely drive down transportation costs and food costs in Alaska. So it would be a benefit to Alaskans. And that summer, the same summer as the Slattery Report, there's new resolutions in Congress. Congressman Andrew May, who's a Democrat from Kentucky, and Republican Senator Ernest Gill from Vermont introduced resolutions in their respective houses proposing the identical same thing. Remove Alaska from the quota system entirely. Take it out of the Johnson-Reed Bill. Use any unused visas under the Johnson-Reed Bill to colonize Alaska. And they said this is for, again, economic and national defense reasons. None of these whereases that you can see, whereas world tension has focused our military, whereas the growing importance of Alaska in our defense is emphasized, none of them mention refugees. But then when you get to the resolved part at the end, they say that the bill was to, quote, colonize Alaska with a highly trained and desirable class of citizens who are refugees from foreign persecution. This bill gets tabled, it gets moved to the House Committee on Immigration for consideration. And meanwhile, State Department officials weigh in on this. They seem to willfully miss the point of the whole thing, and they say that the bill is unnecessary because immigrants can already come in through Johnson-Reed, through the original immigration law, and they can go to Alaska if they want to. We don't need to have this complicated thing of bringing them specifically to Alaska and not letting them leave. And so the House of Representatives does not set any sort of date for consideration of this bill. And these hearings are superseded by what was called the King-Hagenock Bill. Before I get to that, just because we've been talking quite a lot about Congress, I had mentioned the Philippines earlier as like an interesting kind of counterpoint to what is happening in Alaska. So the Philippines, also a U.S. territory, was part of, and in the middle of, at this point, a long process of moving towards independence. There had been congressional legislation in 1934 saying soon the Philippines will be able to become independent. So it's part way through that process. It still had a territorial governor, not unlike Alaska, but it was not included in the Johnson-Reed Act's definition as part of the United States. largely for racial reasons. They did not consider Filipinos white, and so they did not want to invite non-white citizens to become part of the United States in the definition, in that immigration definition. So that means that in the 1930s, there's no quota limiting the number of people who can immigrate to the Philippines. Like Alaska, it has a very small Jewish population in the 1930s. It's actually largely Americans, American Jews who had moved to the Philippines. One family set up a cigar factory there, and it was owned by a bunch of brothers who would just kind of move to the Philippines for 2 years, then they'd move back. The next brother would come to be in charge of the factory, and they'd kind of take turns. The little girl in the middle here is named Margot Castle. This is right after her family escaped to the Philippines in 1938 from Germany. So about 1,000 Jewish refugees actually ultimately reached the Philippines in the late 1930s. And that introduces a really interesting and kind of complicated development because after war breaks out, Japan, of course, invades the Philippines. And they treat the Jewish refugees well because they consider them German, allies of Japan. They imprison the Americans who had been the rescuers and brought these refugees to the Philippines. But it is a rescue effort that is possible because of the way that the territorial definition was set up in 1924, in a way that it was set up different from Alaska. So now we have come to the King-Havner bill, which is generally referred to as the Alaska Plan. It's two identical bills. One introduced by William King, a Democrat from Utah, the other by Frank Havner, a Democrat from California. And the bills are much longer. They're very complicated. They're based on that Slattery Department of the Interior report. And they were pitched as for the benefit of the development of Alaska. And I think they were meant to be that in a lot of ways. They called for establishing corporations that would recruit workers for agriculture and mining and fishing and trapping, and those companies would all sell stock. At least 50% of the settlers already had to be American citizens, so not immigrants. And non-citizens would come under the quota system, but they wouldn't be counted until they became citizens, which would only happen 5 years after their arrival. So people who qualified could bring their wives and children, but they still had to pass medical tests and all of the age limits. They had to take an oath of allegiance. They had to work the job for at least 5 years. And if they wanted to apply for citizenship, it would only be after this 5-year mark. So it's a very complicated bill, incredibly convoluted. But it was all designed to respond to all of these anti-immigrant sentiments that the authors had been hearing. So if you accuse them of prioritizing refugees, well, 50% have to be citizens. If you say, well, they're just going to come to the States after they arrive, well, they're not allowed to come to the States to the 48 after they arrive. And since it was officially about developing the territory, the sponsors managed to have the bill referred to not the immigration subcommittee, but the territories subcommittee. The hearings on this bill in the spring of 1940 last 3 days. And while the Departments of Interior and Labor muster as many voices as they can in support, including the Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, the few Alaskan voices that are permitted to speak are all in opposition. Don Carlos Brownell, who had been the mayor of Seward for 9 years, and actually when he testifies in Congress, they ask him, are you still the mayor of Seward? And he says, I'm not sure. Because he had been gone. He was in D.C. It took a long time. And he said that the election had already happened for his successor, but his successor didn't want to be sworn in until Brownell was back in Seward. I'm not sure why. So he's not sure whether he's mayor of Seward. But he goes to Washington, and he objects to this bill, not because of race, not because of anything about Jews, but because he says, quote, it gives absolute power to one man, the Secretary of the Interior, and it's done with no consultation to Alaskans. And that we have no recourse to put a stop to this. His concern is not about immigration, it's about people who are not Alaskans making decisions for Alaska. And so to him, the issue is bureaucracy and red tape and being treated like a colony and not like part of the United States, which he has been told in the 1924 law that he is. And for all of the talk of development about helping Alaska, about helping Alaskans, this is making Alaska a colony. By the second day of the hearings, things go sideways. Robert Reynolds, who had been the man who, that long quote about the alien, diseased, and insane that I read, he is on this committee. And he, at this point, has started his own anti-Semitic newspaper, a different anti-Semitic newspaper than the one I showed. His was called The American Vindicator. He basically takes over the hearings and transforms them to what had been a discussion about development and railroads and infrastructure and how much authority Alaskans should have over their own area. His main complaint is not whether American citizens want to move to Alaska to take jobs. The jobs should be available to them. It doesn't matter if they want them or not. They are jobs for Americans. This exchange between Reynolds and the chief engineer of the Bureau of Mines. And you can see Reynolds is grilling him. He says there are 11 million Americans unemployed. And the Division of Mines is like, yeah, but they're not miners. They can't come up here and just start mining. But Reynolds wins, and the bill dies in committee. It never makes it to the floor of the House or the Senate for any kind of vote. Also crucially, the King-Havner bill hearings are on May 13th, 15th, and 18th, 1940, which is not a quiet time in world history. After invading Norway and Denmark in April, the Nazis had just continued west, and on May 10th, 3 days before the hearings began, they invaded Western Europe, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Here is the Fairbanks Daily News Miter on May 14th, the day after the hearings began. And you can see, like, here's the main thing. Rotterdam surrenders. France concedes the fall of the 10 miles inside the border. The Gronel testimony, the mayor of Seward testifying, is below the fold. That's how big the war had become. And by June, France had fallen. It fell frighteningly quickly. And as Americans saw photos of Hitler by the Eiffel Tower, they then realized that Great Britain was the only bulwark between Nazi Germany and the United States, that France had mobilized 2 million men to defend the homeland, and the U.S., which had been isolationist for 20 years, had pared down its military, had the 17th largest army in the world and a very large coastline. And so Americans begin to worry that the United States is vulnerable, not just if Nazi Germany decides to invade, but vulnerable from within. The idea of a fifth column of spies and saboteurs inside the U.S. that would bring the country down the second the Nazis tried to cross the border. So in June 1940, as France is falling, as the Alaska Development Bill dies, 93% of Americans felt either sure that the Nazis are setting up this spy ring inside the U.S. or they're not. They're not sure it's happening, but are willing to be convinced of it. The FBI begins receiving thousands of tips a day from people who suspect their neighbors might be spies or engulfed in sabotage. Popular magazines have articles like this one, Hitler's slave spies in America, which argues that Jewish refugees could be spies, held hostage, or convinced to do these acts of spying and sabotage, not because they want to, but because their loved ones are held hostage back in Germany. J. Edgar Hoover is ginning up fear in the U.S. And so the national defense aspects of the Alaska Bill, this idea that populating the territory might be a defense against Japan, against Russia, which is at this point allied with the Nazis, against Nazi Germany, was not enough to save that bill. Even if the King-Havner bill had passed, though, it's not clear what might have happened, or if anybody would have been helped by it. By that point, a ship ticket is probably the most crucial piece of documentation that you needed to immigrate. Between 1938 and 1941, there's about 111,000 self-identified Jewish refugees who arrive in New York. There's an animation downstairs that'll show you, and I'm going to show you a piece of that animation. Let me see. This, if I can get it to go. Let's see. Okay, so this is what it looks like in March 1938. All of these ships are ships that are carrying people who self-identified as Jewish refugees. And you can see that they are coming to the United States from all over Europe. And this is what it looks like in 1941. by the summer of 1940, after the Nazis invade France, Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, all of those ports shut down to U.S.-bound transportation. So at the same time all of these discussions are happening in Congress about Alaska, all of those ports are shutting down, and Lisbon becomes your port of escape. And so if you remember Casablanca, it's all about getting your paperwork and trying to get to Lisbon, because from there you can get to the New World. And so for anybody trying to get out, it has just gotten that much more difficult. You now need entry and exit visas for all the countries you're going to travel through. And you need to get your ship ticket, not from your hometown, but from Portugal. So with that, the legislative plan to bring refugees to Alaska, whether on its own or part of a larger development bill, largely dies. Nothing fully goes away, and this is from 1940, this discussion after the creation of the War Refugee Board, which was a government agency tasked with trying to rescue Jews. They bring up Alaska again, and you can see that they can't even remember when it happened. This discussion, you can see that they say it died a noble death, but they get the year wrong of when this debate even happened. So for most people, the idea of using Alaska was very quickly forgotten. In 1946, the American Jewish Yearbook reports statistics again of the Jewish populations of the United States. And you can see that Alaska now has more than 72,000 residents and the same 600 Jews, Jewish people that it had before the war, now 0.83% of the population. So in that decade, there is no significant refugee or Jewish immigrant population coming to Alaska. So Alaska clearly represented a unique opportunity in the minds of many people who advocated for refugees. But I think it also illustrates this tension between the people advocating for refugees are also the people who are willing to discard the idea that Alaskans should make decisions for Alaskans and for Alaska. It's the tension between seeing Alaska as part of the United States or apart from it. Something that isn't resolved to this day, honestly, by a lot of people. So I hope that you will explore the Americans and the Holocaust a bit downstairs. And I think you'll see a lot of these themes of isolationism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, the Great Depression, the things that limited Americans' ability or willingness to respond, and the people who pushed through those fears and responded anyway. And I hope it helps to see the Alaska plans in kind of this wider context, because I think one of the main questions of this history is who gets to be an American. And that is true both of the refugees coming, but it's also true of Alaska and Alaskans during this time too. So thank you for sticking with me through this quick run of the 1930s and 40s, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have about anything you saw downstairs or anything we talked about today too. So thank you.
How much is the Jewish population growing on Master Atlantic today?
Oh, it's a great question. I don't know, honestly. I have not looked. One of the challenges that the American Jewish Congress faced is that when they were tracking immigration and movement, Hebrew was a racial category under U.S. law. And so people could self-report themselves as Hebrew in censuses and in immigration paperwork. And then in the middle of the war, they kind of looked around and said, should we be classifying Jewish as a racial category, or is that something that Nazis do? And so there's actually a big debate in the Jewish community, because it was the way they counted, was through this kind of U.S. Infrastructure, and ultimately it gets removed. So it's all self-reported as to who is Jewish and who is not, and what that means, and whether it's a kind of racial idea or whether it's the religion that you practice. So I think it's larger. It's certainly not the largest. It's probably around that 1% part. I don't know. I'm going up. I don't know if anybody's been to the Anchorage Jewish Museum. I'm going up there tomorrow, and they may have a better answer than I do on that.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting to hear how the former mayor of Seward went to D.C. and in that nice gentleman who gave the last presentation, Keziah. Tom, he said something about the Seward Chamber of Commerce advocating for the Alaska plan to come to Seward. Do you have any Can you touch on that, what they said?
Yeah, it's interesting to see how split Alaskans are. And in Seward, you know, it's a port city at this point. There's a lot of people coming in and out, and a lot of people from different backgrounds coming in and out because it was such a port city. And so I think some of the like racial fears aren't as present here in Seward as they are in other areas of Alaska. And I think you see that in the mayor's testimony of saying, like, it's not because they're Jewish. It's because we really feel like we should be making decisions for ourselves, and we should not be removed from the United States in this way. Because if we were removed from the United States here, where does that stop? And how many times are people going to step in and not allow us to have a voice? Yeah.
Well, Anchorage, if you know a little bit of statistic, Anchorage School District has the largest second language of any school district in the whole country where their second language is spoken in the household.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And
What's
school
the
district has the
language?
largest number of
Yeah.
second languages
Yeah.
of any school district in the whole country
Yeah.
because of its, Anchorage has a lot of influx of immigrants.
A lot of different languages,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
including indigenous languages.
Yeah.
Indigenous,
Yeah.
Did you personally have any involvement in the Ken Burns series on Good American Holiday?
I did. I was an advisor on it, and I'm in it. So if you watch, I'm in the third episode mostly, but I'm in the first episode and I'm in the second episode once. So I'm one of the talking heads in the series, and work with them on it. Yeah.
So do you have any personal feeling on how it carried out?
I'm biased because if there was something I disagreed with, I told them and they generally fixed it. And so I'm biased because it came out the way that I thought it should. I think it's a very complicated story, and that Jeffrey Ward, the writer who wrote it, is incredibly skilled. And that I'm really proud of it. I think it's good. I think one of the flaws is it's 6.5 hours, and so you do have to take your time watching it, but that's true of all Ken Burns films. I think they are one of the groups that were the most receptive to critique from historians that I've ever worked with. And so we got together many, many times, and if one of us raised an issue, they explored it. They never dismissed a historian who had an issue with anything that they saw or any of the presentation of the film. So I'm pretty proud of it. Yep.
Where can one find Talk Keziah's writing about the Alaska Plan? Was it in a book or a series of...
It's a series of articles, and it's from the late 90s. Yeah, it's from the newspaper. I think you can probably look up his name in Alaska Plan and find it somewhere. If not, Stu, do you have...
I have a link to it.
So,
if you want to leave your email for me,
Yeah.
I can send you a link. I can also tell you he's getting ready to release another series similar to what he presented to us in the Anchorage Daily News. So look for that series coming up. Of course, it's electronic for us, but yeah.
Yeah. I will say his series on the Alaska Plan from the 90s is excellent. Much more detailed than I provided. I did more kind of setting the stage of it within the context of immigration generally. But he got into, refugees in Germany who learned about the prospect of Alaska and then trying to get to Alaska. The Department of the Interior actually sends one of them that Department of the Interior report. So like this 80-page report, they send it to Germany. So this guy can read up on potentially going to Alaska. But so Tom gets into some really amazing stuff, and I highly recommend his writing on this. Again.
I've only been introduced to one other Holocaust museum in San Antonio, Texas. Are all of the Holocaust museums affiliated with USH? Ma'am?
We are not all affiliated officially. So the museum that I work with is part of the U.S. government. We're a quasi U.S. government private partnership, meaning that the U.S. government funds my salary, the salaries of some others, enough to keep the lights on. And a lot of our sort of outreach, like me coming to Seward, is funded with private donation. Most of the Holocaust museums around the country are funded largely by either state or private donation. And so they're not, we're not like a mothership and then these are satellite campuses. Everyone is kind of doing their own thing, but we work together in terms of teacher training. We create a lot of lesson plans that we then give to them if they want to use and distribute, just because all boats need to rise. You know, every community needs a Holocaust museum or somebody who can help with Holocaust education and training and that sort of thing. And so whatever we can do to make it so that all of these local centers don't have to reproduce all of the work, because we do have probably the largest physical collection of artifacts and things, because it is funded by the government and we're able to do that work. And so we tend to create resources that can be used no matter the context, no matter the state, no matter the area, no matter whether it's taught in English or 6th grade English or 12th grade social studies. We try to create resources that they can then use in their populations if they want to either give directly to teachers or to supplement with something that makes it specific to what's going on in San Antonio. You know what I mean? So we're not all connected legally, but we are friends, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I missed your intro. Where are you based?
I'm based in D.C. I'm with the Holocaust Museum in D.C. Yep. Yes.
So I got a question.
Sure.
So, what about the interaction with the Jewish immigrants that came over with indigenous peoples of the United States?
That's a great question. And I don't know that much about it, to be honest with you. And I can't think of anyone who's written a book on it. There are a lot of Jewish immigrants who come over in the early years, in 33, 34, 35, who end up teaching at HBCUs. I know not the same, but in terms of Jewish refugees' interaction with so-called minority groups, I assume that the same is true in a few cases for tribal education. A lot of HBCUs, and I assume, though I'm not sure, tribal educators saw it as a fire sale on really good academics who have come and were not permitted, or, you know, major white universities had quotas on the number of Jewish professors they would have and the number of Jewish students they would have. And so the ability to bring people in who are highly trained academics in Europe and bring them into schools and colleges was really appealing. When we do work, the Holocaust Museum does work in tribal territory, one of the things that we emphasize is, in terms of propaganda, there were a lot of tribes who used the swastika as a historic symbol. You know, it was a historic...
To Germany?
It did not belong to Germany. No, it was a historic symbol used by all sorts of groups, by Hindu groups, by Native groups. And there's a big movement among tribes in the 1930s to denounce swastika. And we have articles from tribal newspapers about the clear awareness of what is happening in Germany, the clear displeasure and disgust as to what is happening in Germany, and this decision to stop using the swastika, very publicly stop using the swastika because it is now a symbol of hate.
Back in the 80s, I was out in the bush and I was working at a mental health center and had a psychiatrist consultant. And we got to talking and I said I'm a black case from and black depersonation. And he looked at me and he said, "Where at?" And I said, "You never heard of my whole film." So I told him, and he looked at me and his eyes got real big. It's tight on it. You're not going there and nothing there. And he asked me if I knew anybody there, and I said, "Yeah, I grew up there with my grandma and my great-grandma and my grandfather." And he said, "Well," he mentioned my great-grandma's age. And I said, "Oh, do you want to talk fuck to my house?" He said, "She can't still be alive." Well, she lived over so she was still alive, never by kind, never lost it. But they got to talking, and I just sat there listening to them. And that's what I wanted to listen to the conversation, and they were talking, and they were talking about polio and how there were a lot of different Jewish people that came through there quietly.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So another thing that happened was Jewish doctors would come couldn't pass their medical boards to practice outside of tribal areas,
Yep.
but could practice in tribal areas. So that makes a lot of sense too.
And a lot of them ended up learning, like, from my great grandma.
Yeah.
Coding taught us, about different plants.
Yeah.
Things like that. Learning about using the different plants.
There you go.
So
yeah,
they were
it's
trading.
It's all part of this wider kind of U.S. white population not being.
good enough to be white.
Yes. And so Jewish doctors would come, like they're absolute specialists in their fields, whatever, but the U.S. won't let them practice here unless they pass the boards or unless they like go back into school. And so you see even a lot of people who are surgeons in the U.S. become psychiatrists here because they feel like it's easier than trying to pass the boards. But some of them do go and start practicing in tribal territories because the rules are different. And they can go and they can still practice medicine. Yeah, so that makes a lot of sense.
Wow.
Rebecca, I'd like to thank you
Yeah,
again
thank
for
you.
coming. Yeah.